Today we've heard many perspectives on water. Brian Richter gave us a global overview, while Ken Reckow focused on water quality in North Carolina. We've heard from conservationists, public agencies, and private industry. One last perspective that is absolutely essential to this conversation is the perspective of a farmer. It is my pleasure to introduce Donald Chase. Donald Chase is a third-generation farmer from Macon County, Georgia, who raises irrigated peanuts and corn on 1,600 acres of land along the Flint River. Chase Farms also has a poultry operation. Please join me in welcoming Donald Chase.
Oh, very good. Well, just let me tell you how honored I am to be here. I've enjoyed all the presentations that I've heard today, and it's kind of nice to get some differing perspectives. And let me tell you that my presentation is not going to focus on nutrient management and water quality like we had from the last presentation. Not that we didn't deal with those issues, not that those issues are not important, but we have a much greater issue in water quantity. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I live just south of Oglethorpe on that slide, and if you see there's a little cleared area on that Google map, those are some of my pivots. And the dark line that runs down the middle of Macon County there is the Flint River. And we've talked a lot about the Flint River and what it means to agriculture. Over on the eastern part of that county, you'll see another cluster of pivots. And in fact, a slide a little later, you'll be able to see how we've gotten a lot of pivots in from our area and to the south. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about water plans. And take us back a long, long time ago to a water plan that was based on perfect information. You see, the Pharaoh had this dream, and Joseph was able to interpret the dream for him and told him, well, we're going to have 7 years of drought after we have 7 years of plenty. And they built, not the pyramids, but some type of storage structure so they could keep that grain for those 7 years. And it always strikes me when I think about it that I wonder what the people saw when they started building these silos to store this grain, and they said, we're doing this based on some guy's dream? But it worked, and they put together a plan. And what y'all are doing and being stewards of the future is we're planning for what might happen. Well, we don't have perfect information. We have imperfect information. And so these are sort of my opinions, if you will, about what imperfect information we have. Well, we've talked about it today, not just in North Carolina, not just in Georgia, but worldwide. We have increasing demands on fresh, clean, fresh water. We have the possibility of climate change. As farmers, I don't know what we think about it. But my next point says it doesn't matter because I'm pretty convinced that there's going to be some droughts every now and then. In 2007, we had a drought that really caused us a lot of concern. And in fact, it caused great concern in Atlanta, in the metropolitan areas. You know, I don't know when, but I'm pretty sure the next one's coming. And the time to plan is not that day. The time to plan is today. Well, we've seen a loss in our rural populations. The last projections, I live in a county that has 13,000 people, and they're calling for us to go to 8,000 people. I think we're seeing this going around the country, and we're seeing less representation in our state governments. We're also seeing large gains in the urban and suburban populations, and there are positive and negatives of that. The positives of that are that they need food. And we, particularly in Georgia and North Carolina, are positioned to deliver that to them. And I love the local food movement. We also raise 60 acres of sweet corn that we sell at a roadside market. And this is an opportunity for us to become more connected to our urban and suburban neighbors. Probable legal challenges. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I'm telling you, we're going to have more of that. Well, let's talk about Georgia because I'm not that well acquainted. This is a land use map, and I doubt you can read the numbers, but the numbers for population in 1980 were about 5.4 million, and now we've gone to a little over 9 million. I can remember that much. So I think probably North Carolina experiences the same type of growth. And here's where I think the story gets told. If you look, the tan area is for cropland, has dropped like almost 2 million acres. In that same length of time, I think it starts in 1974, in that same length of time, the what I would call suburban growth went from 610,000 acres to a little over 3 million acres. And that's a significant portion. And why I point that out is the folks who live in a concentrated urban environment, I don't think have the need for resources. And we talked about lawns and all that type of thing. But if you live in a concentrated urban environment, they still have a need for food. But I don't know that the competition for water resources is as great as in those suburban areas. So what did we do about all this? Well, we started a long time before 2007, and we established a permitting system in the state of Georgia. Prior to 1990 and 1989, those permits were grandfathered in. If you had been irrigating prior to that, those permits were grandfathered in. If you want to apply for a permit today, you can receive a permit perhaps, but it has limitations on it. And in periods of dry flow, all these permits are specified that you could lose the ability to irrigate. That's an important thing to consider. We also, about this same time, started metering our own irrigation systems. I think this causes some people a little heartburn, but I've always been one who believes that the best story we can tell is the truth. And whatever the truth is, let it be told. And if we need to work on some conservation measures, we'll work on conservation measures. But let's don't assume things till we have good data. A little later, perhaps I think around 2005, we established the Flint River Drought Protection Act. At that time, there was a little money available from a tobacco settlement that farmers could be paid for not irrigating. And for a couple of years there was money available. Since that time, there's been no money available. So that's still there, and it still has a provision to suspend irrigation. The state then in 2009 started on this statewide water planning councils. It divided the state into 11 regional councils, and Farm Bureau was instrumental in getting assurances from the governor that there would be a certain number of farmers placed on these councils. I'll go into that a little bit more later. We had a legal battle with Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, which I think may have been solved. And the reason I say I think is that you're never really sure. But there is, at this date, an ongoing legal battle with the state of Florida over flows. And this one causes me a great deal of concern because it's already made it to the Supreme Court, who's appointed a special master. So let's go back to talk a little bit about the water planning councils and why perhaps I'm here today. This is the Upper Flint Water Planning Council, of which I couldn't convince my friends not to appoint me as chair. It's interesting to note, if you'll look at the green dots on there, those are permitted irrigation systems. And notice about halfway up there is very little, if any, irrigation. And that is the fall line. I assume y'all have a fall line here in North Carolina where the Piedmont meets the coastal plain. And that is the fall line, so there is very little irrigated agriculture above that point. And if you'll see, Macon County there is sort of right in the middle. And from that point farther southward, you see a lot of irrigation systems. And you'll see here the number of acres of irrigated acres in the Upper Flint Water Planning Council. Another thing to notice here is that as you get towards the upper part of that area there, you have some larger cities, not exceptionally large cities, but the city of Griffin is one that comes to mind. It has about 70,000 residents. What did we learn from this process? First, we did the flow models, and you guys have heard a little bit of talk about flow models and unimpeded flows and this type of things. And I'm not going to go into that any further, but to tell you that we have a node right there at Montezuma. As a matter of fact, it was on the river just by my farm, and in the 70 years of data, given current use, there were no shortfalls at that node. And that made us feel really good. But that doesn't tell the whole story. The whole story is at the bottom of the river at Bainbridge as it flows into the Apalachicola. And there we had shortfalls defined in the model by 7Q10 and several other factors, 13% of the time. Now, in college, I was pretty tickled if I made an 87%. But this is something to consider. And this is why I think it's imperative for us to embark on these efforts to conserve. The models had their weaknesses, however. The city of Griffin in 2007 built a large reservoir, and they were unable to get water any other way, so they built this large reservoir. It was a very nice facility, and it was assumed in the model that they had flows. They were going to use their permitted flows all the time, regardless of times of low flow. In the city, that particular instance, the intake was above the water level, so it was just physically impossible to do. So there were things that we saw in the model that we weren't happy with, that we thought maybe this doesn't make a lot of sense. There are bright spots. We talked about some bright spots today already. We talked about some new technologies. We talked about the John Deere folks brought us some monitors that will monitor and allow us to use our water more efficiently. We talked about variable rate irrigation and scheduling. We talked about biotechnology a little bit and how those things, those drought-tolerant crops, might offer us alternatives. And we talked about, well, I don't know that we talked about it, but I believe that some of the solution to water usage lies right here, and with our land-grant universities and their ability to do research on what plants really need to produce effectively. I'm going to skip over that last one because I want to tell you perhaps the most important thing that we learned in all this process is that we can work together. And we did it well on our Water Policy Council. We established a decision-making process that was only going to make a decision based on consensus. And to me, it took us several meetings to establish that policy. But once we got past that and we held to it, then it made things so much easier. A group that Mr. Richter mentioned earlier today was the Acf Stakeholders Group, which is stakeholders from north of Atlanta all the way to the Apalachicola Bay oysters. And they have that same policy. And I'm excited because theirs is a voluntary, non-state funded opportunity to work together. And I guess if I was going to conclude with anything, it would be we have friends everywhere, not just in agriculture, but in the municipalities, and we have it in government, and we need to be working together and finding solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. We have time for one question. So who would like to ask a question of Donald?
Since you were sitting at my table with me and we got to chatting about the fact that you're from Georgia and I went to Georgia Tech, which is in Atlanta, I have gone tubing on the Chattahoochee, and several years ago I was paying attention and listening to the radio when they were talking about Lake Lanier and Atlanta and the issue with the, I guess it's the Fish and Wildlife Service. Was that who they were having the keeping the
more likely it was the Corps of Engineers.
Keeping that flow going.
That was the Corps of Engineers, I would think.
So as you mentioned that there's an ongoing one, is it on those mandatory releases, or is it on something else that the issue is currently being argued over?
The issue is the shortfalls at Bainbridge, and Florida is asking for flows to be, I believe it's 5,000 CFM. And that's where the shortfall comes in. The 13% of the time we don't meet that flow. The Chattahoochee is a regulated river controlled by the Corps of Engineers with dams and management policies and that type of thing. That's part of the issue, is that we have to alter that policy with the Corps of Engineers. The Flint is unregulated. And so, you know, there is that idea that perhaps the Flint is the problem, or that agriculture is the problem. And I can appreciate people who might think that. But the bottom line is it's all got to come together. And that's what really encouraged me about the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint Stakeholders Organization, is that it is indeed people at Lake Lanier or at West Point Lake and all these lakes on the Chattahoochee as well. I must ask y'all to, if you want to find a beautiful river, and this is another reason why water quality may not be so pressing on our minds. American Rivers did a great video on the Flint River. If you want to go, it's americanrivers.org, and there's a great video that shows what I consider to be most beautiful part of this country.
Thank you. Thank you, Donald, for being an essential part of the program.